Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. Imagine standing on the smoldering rooftops of Berlin on a cold March morning in 1944. The sky above, once dominated by the ruthless might of the Luftwaffe, suddenly shimmers with the impossible. What would you do if, in that moment, you saw an enemy fighter slicing through the clouds in a place it simply shouldn't exist? An American P-51 Mustang, having flown all the way from England, engaging in 30 minutes of fierce aerial combat, and still having the fuel to return home? This was no ordinary day in the skies. It was the day German air supremacy quietly died, not with the roar of engines nor the thunder of machine guns, but with the stunned silence of seasoned pilots confronting a truth they could hardly believe. On March 6, 1944, over the heart of a burning Berlin, German fighter pilots glimpsed the dawn of a new era. The sleek, silver P-51 Mustangs appeared as if conjured by some miraculous hand, a weapon capable of striking anywhere within the Reich and returning safely to England. The psychological shock was immediate. For the first time, the Luftwaffe understood they were no longer fighting just another enemy plane. They were facing an instrument that could reach deep into their own territory, unchallenged. This is the story of how a single aircraft altered the course of World War II, shattered German morale, and redefined aerial warfare. Imagine Hermann Goering gazing skyward at those gleaming Mustangs over his capital, whispering the words that would echo through history. I knew the jig was up, but the P-51 Mustang almost didn't exist. It began not as a revolutionary design, but as a reluctant afterthought, a consolation prize. In April 1940, as German Messerschmitts tore across European skies and Britain faced the grim possibility of standing alone, the British Purchasing Commission turned to North American aviation with an urgent plea: produce more Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. Britain needed fighters, and it needed them fast. Yet James Kindleberger, North America's chief designer, had a bolder vision. Rather than merely reproducing an outdated aircraft, he proposed a daring plan: design and build an entirely new fighter from scratch, just 117 days to completion. The British, desperate and near despair, accepted the gamble. What emerged was nothing short of revolutionary. The early Mustang featured a laminar flow wing that cut through the air with surgical precision and an Allison engine that excelled at low altitudes, though it struggled high above Europe where the war was raging. These early Mustangs were formidable, but they weren't the game changer the world would soon witness. That transformation came when British engineers, experimenting with captured planes, installed the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same heart that had defended Britain during the Battle of Britain. The result was breathtaking. While the Allison-powered Mustang could barely breach 20,000 feet, the Merlin-powered version roared past 30,000 feet, faster and higher than any previous Allied fighter. Crucially, it carried enough fuel to fly from England to Berlin and back, a capability that no other Allied aircraft possessed. And so, the tale of the P-51 over Berlin begins with a near-catastrophic crisis that had threatened to tip the war in Germany's favor, a crisis that, in a twist of ingenuity and audacity, would produce the very weapon that would haunt the Luftwaffe to its core. Picture the skies over Germany in late 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign, once a symbol of unstoppable Allied might was unraveling in disaster. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, the pride of the U.S. Army Air Forces, were being cut down in staggering numbers by German fighters. The infamous mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, forever etched in history as Black Thursday, was a catastrophe. Of 291 bombers dispatched, 60 were destroyed and 138 badly damaged. Losses like these weren't just tragic, they were unsustainable. The reason was painfully clear. Allied fighters couldn't escort the bombers all the way to their targets. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a fighter of considerable strength, could manage only about 475 miles before running low on fuel. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had a longer range, yes, but it was complex, costly, and faltered in the freezing thin air above Germany. German pilots quickly adapted, learning to lie in wait until the escorts turned back, then swooping down on the defenseless bombers. What the Allies needed was a fighter capable of accompanying bombers on a round trip of over 100 miles from England to Berlin and back. Aviation experts scoffed. It was impossible. Carrying enough fuel would weigh a fighter down, making it sluggish and vulnerable against the nimble German interceptors. Yet, within this crisis, the seeds of a remarkable transformation were quietly taking root. In scattered hangars across Britain, American mechanics and British engineers toiled together, forging one of history's most extraordinary military collaborations. The breakthrough came in October 1942 when test pilot Ronald Hawker lifted a Merlin-powered Mustang into the sky. What he discovered was electrifying. The aircraft didn't just perform at high altitudes, it excelled, astonishingly fast and agile, defying expectations for a single-engine fighter. Early combat revealed both promise and the growing pains of the P-51. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, flying escort missions in early 1944, experienced this firsthand. Separated from his squadron over Oschersleben, Howard could have turned back, but instead, he charged alone into a swarm of more than 30 German fighters. For 30 harrowing minutes, he wove through enemy planes, firing relentlessly. That day, Howard earned the Medal of Honor, but even more significant was the lesson he demonstrated. The P-51 wasn't just another fighter. It was a weapon capable of rewriting the rules of air warfare. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was profound. German pilots, accustomed to the comforting knowledge that deep penetration missions left Allied fighters gasping at the edge of their range, now faced fresh, aggressive Americans hundreds of miles inside the Reich. Their old tactical manuals, reliable since 1940, were suddenly useless. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most seasoned fighter commanders, later recalled the day the High Command finally faced the grim truth of the Mustang. Even as official reports insisted that no long-range Allied fighters operated over Germany, Galland and his pilots were confronting Mustangs daily. The disconnect between bureaucratic denial and battlefield reality reached almost absurd levels. Galland once climbed into a Focke-Wulf 190 himself to investigate reports of American fighters over Berlin only to have the Mustangs strike first. His wingman was shot down. Galland barely escaped by firing his guns forward, producing enough smoke and chaos to convince the pursuers they were under attack from behind. Thus, the transformation of the P-51 from a competent low-altitude fighter into the war-winning escort of 1944 stands as one of military history's crowning engineering triumphs. American aerodynamics fused with British engine mastery, creating an aircraft neither nation could have produced alone. A plane that would, in a single day over Berlin, shatter German morale and redefine the air war forever. Picture the Mustang soaring across the European sky, its Packard-built Merlin engine roaring with power, not just delivering blistering speed and unmatched high-altitude performance, but also the fuel efficiency needed to carry it on those critical long-range missions. Yet technology alone didn't make the P-51 a game-changer. The aircraft demanded more than raw engineering brilliance. It required new tactics, fresh training approaches, and a complete rethinking of what air combat could be. American pilot programs adapted rapidly, teaching aviators how to exploit the Mustang's strengths while mitigating its weaknesses. The result was a generation of pilots who approached distance, endurance, and maneuvering in ways that confounded their German opponents. The introduction of the long-range P-51 fundamentally challenged decades of military assumptions about air warfare. Since World War I, conventional wisdom dictated that fighters were short-range defensive tools intended to protect territory close to home rather than penetrate deep into enemy lands. The Mustang shattered this belief entirely. It was no longer just a plane. It was a statement that the heart of Germany was suddenly within reach. The psychological impact of the Mustang was as decisive as its technical specifications. German pilots had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm. Allied fighters would appear at the edge of German airspace, skirmish briefly, and then retreat as fuel ran low. Bombers would continue deeper into enemy territory, increasingly vulnerable, until the Luftwaffe struck them on their return. This predictable pattern allowed German commanders to conserve their forces and strike at the optimal moment. The Mustang demolished that pattern overnight. Suddenly, American fighters were appearing not just on the borders of the Reich, but over Berlin, Munich, and other deeply protected targets. Even more alarming, these pilots weren't limping home on fumes. They were fresh, aggressive, and capable of sustained combat hundreds of miles from their bases. No corner of German-controlled territory was safe. Eastern training bases thought untouchable came under assault. Aircraft factories in Bavaria felt the sting of the Mustang's reach. The psychological shield of Germany's interior vanished with the silver flash of Mustangs appearing where no enemy fighter had ever dared to fly. This new reality forced the Luftwaffe to rethink everything. Air defenses could no longer be concentrated safely. Experienced pilots could no longer be rotated to rear areas for rest and training without risking annihilation. An entire organizational philosophy built around strategic depth and sanctuary had to be abandoned. The threat could appear anywhere, at any time. The solution the P-51 offered to the range problem was both elegant and revolutionary. External drop tanks, combined with the engine's fuel efficiency, created an operational radius previously unimaginable. But the genius of the Mustang wasn't just in fuel capacity, it was in the way that fuel was tactically employed. Pilots developed entirely new combat techniques to leverage the plane's advantages while mitigating its vulnerabilities. The liquid-cooled Merlin engine, while powerful, was more susceptible to damage than the air-cooled engines of aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt. A single, well-placed shell could puncture the cooling system, forcing a pilot to abandon the aircraft hundreds of miles from home. This vulnerability shaped a new style of fighting. Speed, surprise, and diving superiority became essential. Mustang pilots didn't just escort bombers defensively, they hunted. Fighter sweeps emerged as a tactic born of the P-51's range. Instead of waiting to meet German pilots at the border, Mustangs sought out Luftwaffe bases, attacking planes in training and striking at the heart of German air power. The experienced pilots themselves, who could never be replaced as easily as machines. More than a plane, the P-51 became a tool that reshaped Allied strategic thinking. It allowed the Allies to project force deep into Germany, to dominate the skies not just at the edges of the Reich, but across its entire heartland. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers, it redefined what it meant to control the air, and in doing so, changed the very nature of aerial warfare. Imagine for a moment the pre-war doctrine that dominated aviation theory. The bomber will always get through. It was a comforting belief, a kind of gospel that assumed sheer numbers and armor could overcome opposition. But by 1943 and 1944, that notion had proven tragically naive in the face of determined high-flying fighter attacks. The P-51 Mustang didn't just challenge this doctrine, it demolished it. For the first time, the Allies could combine the strategic reach of heavy bombers with the tactical agility of fighter aircraft, creating a new form of aerial warfare that leveraged the strengths of both while minimizing their weaknesses. The training programs designed for Mustang pilots reflected this revolution in thinking. Special clobber colleges sprang up to teach American aviators not just how to fly the plane, but how to fight at extreme range. Pilots learned to manage fuel carefully during prolonged combat, navigate hundreds of miles back to England after hours of intense dogfighting, and maintain their composure while deep in enemy territory. This was an entirely new discipline, combat at distances where pilots had previously feared to tread. Yet, the Mustang's operational success carried moral complexities that remained difficult to reconcile. By attacking German training bases, American pilots frequently faced young student aviators, teenagers barely out of school, still learning the basics of flight. Nicknamed clay pigeons, these inexperienced pilots were a strategic necessity to target, but also a sobering ethical challenge. Many Mustang veterans would wrestle with the weight of these decisions for decades after the war. German prisoners of war provide chilling testimony to the Mustang's psychological and tactical impact. Captured Luftwaffe pilots repeatedly identified the P-51 as the most dangerous Allied fighter, not always because it could outturn a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf in a tight dogfight, but because it could appear anywhere, strike decisively, and sustain combat for hours. Kurt Bulligan, a German ace with 112 victories on the Western Front, admitted that while German fighters could occasionally outmaneuver the Mustang in close quarters, its combination of speed, range, and endurance made it almost impossible to counter. Personal accounts from German pilots further illuminate the Mustang's intangible effects. Obergefreiter Walter Wolfram, who flew a captured P-51 after the war, described the plane as both astonishing and intimidating. Its cockpit, crammed with controls and switches, felt overwhelming compared to the simplicity of German designs. This contrast highlighted a profound difference in philosophy. German aircraft favored simplicity and ease of production, while American engineering pursued complexity to maximize performance and capability. The P-51's presence transformed the strategic bombing campaign itself. By providing reliable daylight escort, it enabled precision bombing that might otherwise have been impossible. Without the Mustang, American forces may have been forced to adopt the British night bombing approach with its reduced accuracy and higher civilian casualties. In a paradoxical way, the Mustang both increased the effectiveness of the bombing campaign and mitigated some of its human cost. Yet the ethical and human consequences of this technological edge were unavoidable. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was increasingly staffed by inexperienced pilots, many with fewer than 20 hours of training. Long-range Mustang missions destroyed German training facilities systematically, creating a vicious cycle. Seasoned pilots were lost, inexperienced replacements arrived, and the newly trained men became easy prey for the now battle-hardened American Mustang pilots. The P-51's legacy extended far beyond World War II. Its operational concept, deep strike fighters, capable of projecting power across vast distances while maintaining combat effectiveness, laid the foundation for Cold War aviation. From the F-86 Sabre in Korea to modern multi-role fighters, the influence of the P-51 can be traced through generations of aircraft development. Yet the success of the Mustang came at an environmental and logistical cost rarely acknowledged in popular histories. Each mission consumed hundreds of gallons of high-octane fuel, a precious resource requiring complex refinement and an intricate supply chain. Maintaining a P-51 unit ensuring fuel, ammunition, and spare parts crossed the English Channel or reached forward bases in France was an organizational triumph in its own right, often overshadowed by tales of aerial heroism. The P-51 was not merely a plane, it was a catalyst for a new way of thinking about air power, a weapon that reshaped tactics, strategy, and even the psychology of war. Its presence over German skies forced a recalibration of every assumption held by pilots, commanders, and engineers alike. Picture the Normandy beaches on D-Day. Thousands of Allied soldiers storming the shore under the watchful eyes of German defenses. Yet, in the skies above, only 2 enemy aircraft dared to appear, a number that would have been unimaginable earlier in the war. This was no accident. The P-51 Mustang, with its unprecedented range and combat capability, had cleared the skies, granting Operation Overlord the tactical air superiority it desperately needed. The Mustang's triumphs went far beyond mere statistics. They reshaped the battlefield itself, allowing ground forces to move with unprecedented freedom under the protective umbrella of American air power. The psychological dimension of the Mustang was equally profound. German civilians, long told their skies were impregnable, now saw sleek American fighters circling overhead as if defying every expectation. The mere sight of these silver angels undermined confidence in the Reich in ways bombing raids alone could not achieve. Morale eroded as the myth of invulnerability crumbled before their eyes. And then came that day in March 1944 when Hermann Goering, looking up from the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, saw American Mustangs flying freely over his capital. He witnessed more than a simple air raid. He glimpsed the future of warfare itself, a future where distance offered no sanctuary, where technological ingenuity could trump numerical superiority, and where what seemed impossible was rendered inevitable. German pilots who once scoffed at reports of single-engine fighters over Berlin soon discovered the truth. The Mustangs were real, relentless, and deadly. Many never returned from encounters with the P-51s, which appeared from nowhere, struck with lethal precision, and vanished into the vast European sky, only to return again the following day and the day after that. The P-51 Mustang proved a critical lesson in innovation. Transformation in war rarely comes from entirely new inventions. Instead, greatness emerges when existing technologies are combined with audacious operational vision. American engineering, British Merlin engines, and the pressing demands of wartime necessity coalesced into a machine greater than the sum of its parts, an aircraft that didn't merely fight battles, but had the power to win them. By the end of the war, P-51 pilots claimed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter, despite the Mustang arriving relatively late in the conflict. Yet, numbers alone cannot convey the profound psychological effect of a fighter that appeared where no one believed it could exist, struck where no Allied plane had struck before, and returned day after day to confront the enemy. The enduring lesson of the P-51 echoes far beyond the Second World War. In the crucible of mortal combat, advantage rarely belongs to the strongest or the most numerous. It belongs to those who can appear where their enemies believe they cannot be, at the moment their enemies believe they cannot appear. On that fateful day in March 1944, American ingenuity and determination embodied in the sleek silver P-51 Mustang demonstrated that impossible is simply a challenge waiting to be overcome. German pilots who survived encounters with the Mustang carried a sobering truth. They had met their equal, not in a larger, more powerful machine, but in an aircraft that refused to accept the boundaries that had governed air combat since the Wright brothers first lifted into the sky. By defying those limits, the P-51 didn't just help win a war, it redefined the very possibilities of human flight and forever altered the landscape of aerial warfare. The Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a symbol, a paradigm, and a promise that ingenuity, courage, and determination could rewrite the rules of combat and history itself.